So lesson number 1 is a shorter lesson, and there are kind of two main ideas that we need to make sure we take away from it. We need to make sure we know what anatomy is, and we need to make sure we know what physiology is. Shout out to my friend Lauren. I don't know, is Lauren here today that gave us that fun activity or that fun way to remember things? Let me see if I can pull my pen here. Lauren pointed out that when we talk about what anatomy is, anatomy starts with an A, right? So anatomy is where things are at, or the way that we kind of talk about it in your guided lesson. I think of anatomy as what's there. Let's see how well I can write that. What's there? That's anatomy. When we talk about physiology, Lauren pointed out for us that we've got this beginning F kind of sound at the beginning for physiology, and physiology is really all about functions. Physiology is functions. So as we start this class, our class is anatomy and physiology. That's the name of the class. Not only are we learning what's there or where things are in the body, where things are at, we also need to know what their functions are. Now, I know for several of us, we've at least started the lesson, so help me out here. When we talk about anatomy and physiology, these two things, are they or are they not related to each other? Are they related to each other, anatomy and physiology, or not really? What do we think? They dictate each other. Perfect. Yeah, so they are related to each other. I've got a couple of friends in the chat that are saying they see me. If you can't see me, maybe log out and log back in and see if that helps. So for my friends that are still here, that can see things, yes, we're absolutely right. Anatomy and physiology completely related to each other. The word that I see a lot of us posting in the chat, and it's in your guided lesson too, is that they dictate each other. So dictate or determine would be another way we could say it. What that means is if you know what the anatomy of a structure is, you can figure out what its physiology might be. Or if you know the physiology of something, you can predict or figure out stuff about its anatomy. So big picture idea, we need to make sure we know from lesson number 1. Anatomy, what's there or where things are at. Physiology is what those things do, what their functions are. So I'm going to do a kind of absurd example with you guys. I'm going to split you up into groups, and we're going to work with our group members to identify the anatomy and the physiology of things that aren't even part of the body. So the things that each group is going to be doing a different set of examples for me. So I'll show you what our examples are, and then you'll work with your groups on the example that gets assigned to you. Some of us are going to be thinking about the anatomy and the physiology of a sponge, like we see over here on the left. Let's see if I can get my pointer back. Nope, it's gone. So a sponge, like you see on the left, or on the right side, this is called a Brillo pad. So some of us are going to be thinking about the anatomy and the physiology of the two types of things you could have in your kitchen. Some of us are going to be getting in touch with our inner, we wish it was still summer, right? So on the left, some of us are going to be talking about the anatomy and physiology of an inner tube compared to an anchor. And some of us are going to be thinking about the anatomy and physiology of hiking boots compared to slippers. Now, obviously, none of these are parts of the body, right? So what I mean when I talk about something like the anatomy of a hiking boot or the anatomy of a slipper, remember, anatomy is what's there. So when you think about each of these examples, or the example that your group has, if you were trying to describe what's there when we're talking about these items, what are they made of? What do they feel like? What's their shape? Those kind of things are what we would say is the anatomy of something. When we talk about the physiology of these things, physiology is functions. It's what these things do. So As I split you up into groups here in a moment, you're going to work with your group on the set of comparisons that you're going to make. So remember, anatomy means what's there, or how would you describe this particular thing. Physiology is what I would use this thing for. So let me send you guys down the bunny hole again to show you where we're going. Once you guys are split up into your groups, remember we click down here on share content. You will see the name of the group that you're in. So when you're in a group, when you're in your content, we'll click on the files. And you'll notice up here, group 1, group 2, or group 3. So whenever I split you into groups here in just a moment, we're going to go down right here to the share the files, click on the share file area, find your group, and we'll get started. So I'm going to split us up into groups. Let's meet some new friends, and we'll spend about 5 minutes coming up with our answers to the anatomy and the physiology of all these here. So let me move this out of the way, and I'll split us up. I will see you guys in about 5 minutes. All right, we're in transition here. I'm pulling us back into the main room. Light up the chat for me. How did our groups go today? How did we do? And while you're lighting up the chat for me, do me a favor and make sure your microphone's turned off, or I'm gonna start echoing. You only need to hear me once, right? We don't need an echo. Awesome, good. I'm seeing lots of good feedback. I promise, guys, hopefully by next week, I will remember that I need to upload those into each of your groups. I have them all in the main course classroom, and then, of course, I forget to put them in your actual rooms. So thanks for your patience with me as we figure out this group thing together. So I want us to build as a class, since we had a little bit of time to talk about anatomy and physiology, and hopefully time to talk about some other stuff too. Hopefully 5 minutes was a good amount of time with your new friends, right? For my group number 1, you guys were the group that were in charge of telling us or figuring out the anatomy and the physiology of the 2 things in the kitchen, the sponge that I see right here and the Brillo pad. If you guys remember, for those of you who were here yesterday, above the screen, there's the little T, or there's the big T. If you want to help me out here, rather than typing, oh, group 1 had, so I'm doing group 2 then. Sorry, guys. So group 2, friends, you were my Brillo pad and my sponge group. So above the picture on the screen, I think you guys see the letter T. If you click on that, it's going to allow you to start typing, I believe. So if you want to start typing information onto the slide for me of the anatomy and the physiology of these 2 types of sponges. So my friends, I guess from group 2, let's start entering that. We're starting to do it. That's perfect. And for my friends who were not in group 2, notice some of the kinds of things that they're talking about here with the anatomy of a sponge. The anatomy of a sponge is what's there, right? So we're looking at something like someone said it's shaped like a rectangle. I've got my rectangle sponge here. It's full of holes. Like you guys said here, it's definitely very squishy and soft. That is in a great contrast to Brillo pads over here. Not sure how many of you guys have used Brillo pads. I haven't used them nearly often enough, but Brillo pads are very rough. They're actually made out of steel or made out of metal, and then this blue stuff you're seeing is the soap that's on it. So when we talk about anatomy, what's there? We've got this squishy rectangle sponge, or we've got this really hard, pokey Brillo pad that we see over here. When we talk about the physiology of the sponge, remember physiology is what things do. So when we talk about a normal sponge, some of the things that our group came up with for their physiology, I love this, absorbing liquids. That's a great thing that a sponge can do. We help to clean things off. We're getting off stains, that kind of stuff. That's perfect. Yeah, I'm not sure how many of you had used a Brillo pad. Hopefully there's at least 1 or 2 of us that have used them before. I pull out my Brillo pads if, let's just be real here. A couple nights ago, we cooked something that stuck to the bottom of my pan, and I'm finally getting around to cleaning it. I know I'm the only one that ever does that, right? So I have to break out a Brillo pad if I didn't get the dishes done a couple nights back. It cleans off stuff that's really stuck. Yeah, or burnt food. That's a big one too, right? If it's stuck to the bottom because it burned. Absolutely. So we've got 2 different structures. One of them that's really squishy, that has holes inside of it. One of them that's really more compact, that's literally made out of metal. When we talk about their jobs, their physiology, what they do is very different. And that comes down to, in a large part, what they're made out of. This is something that has holes in it, that's squishy, that I can squeeze a little easier. You would not want to squeeze a Brillo pad. That would be painful. So that'd be great for getting off stuff that's stuck. This is better for more general use. Let me look at my question I see here in the chat. For a body part, do you explain where it's located for the anatomy or the details about it, is what Jacqueline's asking. When we talk about the anatomy of body parts, it's actually kind of both things. So when I describe where a structure is found in the body, that is talking about its anatomy. When I describe what that structure looks like, that is also talking about anatomy. When I start saying what I use that structure to do, that's physiology. So where structures are located, what they look like, what they're made out of, all of that kind of stuff is anatomy. Just like our silly examples here, right? So nice work to, I guess, group number 2 with the sponges. So we've got a sponge versus a Brillo pad, anatomy and physiology. Let's move on to, then I guess this was group number 1. Group number 1, we had an inner tube, like we see here on the left, versus an anchor. So my friends in group 1, click on that T above the screen. Let's start filling in the anatomy and the physiology of these two things. So I mentioned that I just picked these random examples, right? Confession moment with Dr. Allis that I picked these examples last night at about, by this point it was about 11:45. So I was trying to think of what are the most different things that I can randomly think of when I'm exhausted at 11:45 at night, but they seem to be working pretty well. You guys ran with them, so that's excellent. When we think about an inner tube, something at least for me this summer that I didn't get to spend nearly enough time in with all of the closed pools, we're absolutely right here that we've got something that's a circle. The big emphasis on here that I'm glad our group picked up on for us is that inner tubes are filled with air. So the fact that the inner tube is filled with air allows it to do its physiology, allows it to do its job where it's keeping us floating. Whereas when we talk about our anchor over here, anchors not filled with air, right? At least good ones aren't. They're actually made of some kind of metal like lead or something that's really heavy. Yeah, so it's got a large bottom part down here like people were talking about. It's got this chain on it. All of these descriptions of what an anchor is, that counts as its anatomy. The job of an anchor, or the physiology anchor, is it's not about keeping you floating. It's actually the opposite, right? It's either to pull you down or like our group really landed on, it's to keep your boat in place, to keep it from going out to sea. Man, it's crazy right now what's going on in the Gulf, right, with Hurricane Laura. So I think even a really good anchor wouldn't help boats that are down there right now. But the goal of anchors, absolutely, keep something in place. If I don't want something to move, I need to put something really heavy, like an anchor made of lead or really hard metal. I'm going to use something really heavy to hold it in place. Otherwise, if I want to float around in that pool or float down a river, I need some air filled that's going to keep me afloat and going to give me a little more mobility. Excellent work for my group on here. One last example. For my friends in group 3, your turn now. Click on that T. Let's start filling in the anatomy and the physiology of these two types of shoes. What are some of our thoughts on hiking boots compared to slippers? When I came up with this example last night, I was really interested in seeing what you guys the physiology of slippers was, what their job is. Yeah, so I'm seeing a lot here when we talk about the physiology of slippers, things like keeping your feet warm, providing a cushion. Excellent note here that slippers, their job is going to happen inside, or at least it's supposed to. You guys know I have a 3-year-old, so we have definitely worn slippers outside multiple times because inside and outside is a very blurry line for a 3-year-old. So slippers, really great for indoor uses, things like cushioning you, keeping your feet warm, or, you know, in the current stage of the pandemic, like something that brings you a little comfort. Maybe slippers make you feel just a little bit better about life. That's some of their physiology. So if I want to keep my feet warm, if I want them to be cushioned, I want something that's soft and fluffy or soft and fuzzy. I don't want something, like we mentioned over here with the hiking boots, that's really heavy. I don't need something that has laces or has a really thick sole. All of those are the anatomy or the structure of a hiking boot. That's not going to be good for comfort, right? It might keep my feet warm, but not in the way I'm looking for with my pair of fuzzy slippers over here. But the good thing about a hiking boot is it's going to keep my feet safe. It's going to help me out when I am outside and I'm, for example, going on a hike. I want something that has a little bit more support. I have something that, like someone mentioned here, is grooved to fit your foot more supportively. So big idea with the shoe examples here, there's very different anatomies or very different structure to these two kinds of shoes. And because we have that different structure, they have different functions as well, different physiologies. Before we actually talk about some of those anatomy examples that you had in your packet, what questions do we still have right now about anatomy compared to physiology? Or shoot me an emoji if you're feeling good. Shoot me an emoji or send me a quick note about what questions we have. Perfect. Lots of smiles, lots of emojis, thumbs ups. Excellent. Okay. So here's the good news. We just practiced predicting anatomy and physiology with random objects that weren't even body parts. You guys did a great job of figuring out what the anatomy and the physiology of stuff was. That's really good preparation for our exam, because on the first exam, I'm going to ask you about structures in the body that we haven't talked about. But if we can figure out what the anatomy of something is and the physiology of something is when that something's not in the body, I promise you guys will be able to do that with other organs, for example, or other bones in the body. So this was really good practice to get us thinking about the difference between anatomy and physiology. So nice work on that. The one example that I know several of us mentioned on our topics we wanted to cover today is we wanted to talk about joints. So we'll for sure talk about joints. And we mentioned blood vessels. So I'll make sure that we talk about those two examples, and then maybe we'll end with a quick discussion of brown fat and white fat. By the way, I saw a question up higher in the chat about visible body. To answer that question about visible body, yes, it is going to take your highest scoring attempt. So you can do it as many times as you want. But here's your friendly reminder, visible body assignments for this week are due by Friday at 11:59. So please make sure we are getting visible body done. Today would be a great day to do that, just to make sure you've got that all taken care of. That's the first assignment that we have due for our class is the visible assignments. They're due on Friday. Everything from lesson number 1, everything else from lesson number 1 is due Sunday by 11:59. So keep that in mind. Gloria asked, does visible body have a test? We're not going to be doing testing in visible body. We're going to be doing assignments in there. So there's visible body assignments, and then there are Blackboard assignments for lab. But all of our testing will be done in Blackboard. Jacob's asking, are the week 1 homework assignments the Blackboard quizzes over the body? I'm guessing that you're asking if it's the assignment in that folder in lab resources in the very bottom folder in there, and that is correct. So weekly homework assignments or something like that, that's in Blackboard. That one's due Sunday. Visible body assignments, there's 2 of them, and they're labeled with the big word assignment, and they have little stars, little asterisks. Those are the ones that are due Friday. So Blackboard stuff due Sunday for lecture and for lab this week. And a question about planes, asked if oblique planes can be anywhere. Yes, they can. And really any of our planes can be anywhere in the body except for a mid-sagittal plane. A mid-sagittal plane has to be in the very middle of the body. So all the other ones, we can do them wherever we want to. Oblique planes included. They can be anywhere. While we're on a brief lab kick, any other specific lab questions? I probably can't review all the bones in the body right now, but any other quick lab questions before we talk about joints? Nicole asks, if we got a 100 and retake the quiz, will the grade change? If you get a grade that is lower than 100, no, it won't. And you can't get a grade higher than 100. So once you get a 100, no, the grade's not going to change anymore. You're welcome to keep doing it for practice. And honestly, I would kind of encourage that because it gives you a chance to test yourself. What I recommended students do in the spring was complete each assignment once with your notes to try to get a 100%. Or once or twice with your notes to try to get a 100%. That's the score that stays in the grade book. Then go back and complete it a few more times to make sure you can answer all of those questions without your notes. Because that when you take exams, no notes allowed. So by quizzing yourself in that way, first let's get our 100%, let's get our 90-some% with our notes helping us. Then let's go back and take it other times just to make sure we fully understand. I will always take your highest scoring attempt though. So it doesn't matter what happens with the score after that. You can complete as many times as you'd like to understand the material. Yeah, so Nicole's mentioning she already took it 9 times. She finally got her 100. She wants more practice. Go for it. Yep. Unlimited attempts means unlimited attempts, and I'll take your highest score. So get your 100 and then practice as much as you want to. Gloria is asking, will all tests be in Blackboard? And then visible body assignments for lab. Yes, so lecture tests and lab tests will be administered through Blackboard. You can already see the folder for where you'll find those Blackboard-based lecture exams. You will have a folder that shows up in lab. In the lab folder later in the semester when we get closer to the midterm exam. So that will pop up and it'll be the same thing. Your lab exam will be administered through Blackboard. The only outside assignments, like you mentioned, are the assignments that we have in Visible Body. But any assignment in Blackboard or Visible Body, you can complete it as many times as you'd like. Yes, you're welcome. Glad to clarify those things for you guys. And I'll mention too that as we get closer to the lab midterm exam, you will also see an optional lab midterm exam assignment pop up. So if you want to review that one, it doesn't matter what you get on that assignment because that one's not actually technically graded in the sense that it's not going into the grade book to count for points, but it is a way for you to check yourself. So that optional assignment is going to pop up for you here really soon, hopefully in the next few days. But that'll be a great review for you for the lab midterm exam. Ariel is asking about the group Wiki. If someone doesn't complete their part, will the assignment's grade be 0? No. So with the first group Wiki especially, this is the getting to know you group Wiki, basically. You just have to complete your part. There's no extra work that you need to do. For when we start doing content wikis, it would be a good idea to try to make sure that all questions on the wiki are answered. I mentioned this on, I think, Monday night. If someone in your group doesn't complete their part by like 10 o'clock the night that it's due, or it's not completed by the next morning after it's due, it would be a good idea to go in and complete extra questions. Couple reasons for this. First reason being the goal of the wikis is to help you make kind of a study guide of sorts with some of the important information from each unit. So having a wiki that has all of those questions answered means that you and your group members are covering a lot of the important ideas or some of the biggest picture ideas from the unit. The other reason for you to go in and fill in any holes that are left, I recognize that extra work for you, but I also reward that extra work. So if someone in your group is not answering questions and you have to answer an extra 1 or 2, I do give extra credit for doing extra work. So try not to leave the questions blank. If you answer your questions and you answer them correctly and thoroughly, you don't have to go back and fill in questions. But it's a chance at making sure that you have covered all the content you need to, and a small grade boost on that as well. So I know it's extra work. You're not going to get a 0 if you don't go in and fill in group wiki. But if you can fill it in, it'll help you learn, and it'll also potentially boost your grade a little bit as well. Long answer to a short question. No, you're not going to get a 0 if your group members don't participate. That's the short answer. Okay. If we have other questions, maybe save them for the end of our class time today. I want to make sure I cover joints and blood vessels with you guys, and then briefly look at the article that you're going to use for brown fat versus white fat for that activity. Today's another day where I am sharing my camera. So my goal is to wrap up covering content with you guys at about 10:45. And then leave the floor open for questions that we might have after that. So let's hit up our example with joints. We'll hit up the example with blood vessels, and then do a little bit there with brown fat versus white fat. So when we talked about joints in the guided lesson, remember that joints are just a fancy name for where 2 bones come together. So there are different ways that bones can come together. One of the ways that bones can come together are what we see on this page, things called sutures. So a suture is one place where things come together. When we talk about sutures, light it up in the chat for me. What would we say about the physiology of sutures? Is this a joint that does or does not move? Suture joints. Exactly. Yep. Lots of us are saying that these are joints that do not move, or sometimes we call them non-moving joints. So no movement at these joints. The physiology of a suture, there's no movement. And I like how we bumped in to how we kind of extended this beyond one place here. So we said that physiology of a suture is that these joints don't move. That allows them to do, as one of our classmates mentioned, that allows them to protect the brain, protects the brain. Oops, can't spell this morning. There we go. When I talk about sutures, these are joints that do not move. Because they're not moving, they help us to protect the brain. There's a question in the chat, do we only find them in the skull? Yes, specifically sutures are only in the skull. There are some other joints that are kind of similar in what they're made out of that are found in other places. So they're also very fine joints, but specifically joints that I call sutures, I'm just going to find those in the skull. By the way, I'll mention for you guys, in the second half of the semester in lab, we are going to have to know our different sutures. So this big one right here is a suture that's called the coronal suture. We're going to have to know that one. The coronal suture is kind of in the place where you might sit a crown on top of the head. So there's the coronal suture. We're also going to have to learn what's called the squamous suture, or sometimes you'll hear it called the squamous suture. That's the one along the side of your skull. We will also need to know the one here in the very back. I'll circle this one back here. This one back, ooh, that's fun. That one back there is called the lambdoid suture. So the lambdoid suture in the very back. So we will be learning specific sutures for lab. You don't have to learn them for lecture right now. What we do have to learn for lecture, though, is the fact that sutures are non-moving joints. Absolutely. So we got a question in the chat. What are some of the ways that we would describe the anatomy of a suture? Any thoughts about how we might describe the anatomy of a suture? Yeah, okay, so I'm seeing the word hard, I'm seeing fibrous. Yeah, so the emphasis being like Jacob mentioned for us, in a suture joint, bones are joined using fibers. So we're using protein fibers, and you can actually see them on this picture where we're zoomed in close. Little tiny proteins that go between the bones and hold those bones together. The other thing that we could mention with a suture joint as well, in addition to holding the bones together with fibers, the bones are close together. So the bones, it almost looks like they're overlapping. Let me turn on my camera and I'll try to show you guys something. The way I like to tell my students to think about what the structure of a suture is if you take one hand and you can see your fingers sticking out, and you take the other hand and have your fingers sticking out, when you put them together like this is kind of what a suture's like. So imagine if there were little protein fibers that went between each of these fingers. The parts of my bone reach out and connect to each other. That's what's going on with a suture. So the bones are almost overlapping. They're almost attached to each other. But if we zoom in really close, they've got these little proteins that are holding them together and keeping them together strongly. So with a suture, I've got fibers that are holding my proteins together. I've got those that are holding my bones together. Excuse me. I've got bones that are really close. And by overlapping them with each other, there's no movement. This is really great for protecting the brain. Now let's compare a suture to a type of joint called a synovial joint. A synovial joint. Whenever we hear synovial joint, there is something that we should be thinking about its anatomy that synovial joint should tip off for us. Can anyone think about, or can anyone remember, when I talk about the anatomy of a synovial joint, what's special about the structure of a synovial joint? What's special out there? Exactly. Several of us have mentioned synovial joints have fluid. So I pulled a picture from online. You don't actually have this one in the guided lesson, but this is what, if I zoomed in really close on a synovial joint, so this is kind of like this joint right here, say, in the finger, for example. We have a synovial joint there. There's the top bone up here and the bottom bone here. Absolutely right. Somebody in our chat mentioned that the bones don't touch. See that on our picture over here. Here's my top bone. Here's my bottom bone. There's a space in between those two bones. And inside that space is where we find that fluid-filled cavity, the synovial fluid that's in between these two bones. Now, I saw at least a couple of mentions in the chat about the physiology of these bones. What are some of the, or these joints? What are some of the things you guys would say about the physiology of a synovial joint? What are some of the things we'd say there? Yeah, so we've got lots of movement. These are my movable joints. Yeah, I like the terminology, flexibility, no friction, absolutely. Stability, no friction. These are the kinds of joints that we're going to find, like you have the example in your packet, between the bones of the fingers. These are going to be the kinds of joints that we find in the wrist, helping your wrist to move. Here's an extension of our discussion of anatomy versus physiology. If you have a part of your body that moves a lot, you're probably going to be able to predict that that part of your body has a synovial joint. So synovial joints are the kind of joints that have a fluid-filled cavity. They have space between their bones. That allows them to move. Their anatomy is dictating their physiology. But remember how we said at the beginning, we can go backwards too. If, like I said, if I know a part of my body does a lot of movement, I can predict that that part of my body must have a synovial joint, because that's the kind of joint that can move. Sutures, not so movable. Synovial joints, we move all over the place. So some part of your body that's moving a lot, there's probably a synovial joint there that's allowing that to happen. Yeah, so Nicole asked a great question. This is one of my favorite questions to answer. When we talk about popping a joint, because hey, this is a zoom in close on your knuckles. I'm gonna make you all want to pop your knuckles now. When you pop your knuckles, what's actually happening is sometimes you get little bubbles inside this synovial fluid. So when I pop my knuckles, I'm actually forcing those air bubbles that are inside this space to pop. So the popping sound that you hear, as long as your joint is healthy, that's the caveat because she asked about bones rubbing. As long as your joint is healthy and you have enough fluid inside here, when you pop your knuckles, you're literally popping air bubbles that are inside there. Jacqueline says she pops everything on her body. Yeah. Last night I popped my knuckles in front of my 2-month-old and actually made him smile. That was really cute. So I might have to start popping my knuckles for him. Jacob's asking if bones rub against each other, is that arthritis? It can be a side effect of arthritis. So what usually causes arthritis is that this joint gets inflamed. So for some reason, the immune system starts attacking it. And so if it starts attacking it, some of these structures inside of here will get swollen. So they're swelling up. That puts a lot of pressure in this area. And if we have a lot of pressure there, the bones might start rubbing. So yeah, it can be a side effect. There again is an application of anatomy and physiology, right? If the connective tissue that's on the outside of this joint gets really swollen, so its anatomy changes, it gets really, really fat and poofy, puts a lot of stress on this area, that's going to change the physiology. Now those bones might rub against each other, or now they rub against these membranes that I find in places, and that would make it really painful. So yeah, the bones can bump into each other if we have arthritis because other parts of my joint, their structure goes bad. So far, we've said that sutures don't move. We've said that synovial joints do move. We've said that synovial joints are found in places like the fingers, where there's space between the bones. Sutures found in the skull, where there's not a lot of space. I gave you guys one last application example of the types of joints that we find in the body. Another type of joint that we find in the body, structures that we call fontanelles. Fontanelles, right? There's lots of them here. Light me up in the chat here. When do we see fontanelles? Where are fontanelles found though? Yeah, so fontanelles found in the fetal skull, in a baby skull. They're actually found up until about age 2.5 or age 3. So yeah, fontanelles are super helpful. I joked with my spring students that I love fontanelles because I just had a baby. So fontanelles are really great for a mom who's having a baby. That ties into their physiology here. Before we do physiology though, with our fontanelles, what can you guys tell me about their anatomy? What's going on with a fontanelle? What are some of the ideas that we remember with those fontanelles? Yeah, these are a lot softer. So a softer joint. So we start talking about things like flexible and movable. The flexibility they have, that some of that might actually carry over here into their physiology, how they work. So they're a little more flexible or movable. Again, we have, yeah, like Jacqueline mentioned for us here, we do still have fibers. But here's an important difference between a suture and a fontanelle. Fibers, let's see, how can I write this easily? Fibers cover a large distance between the bones. Unlike when we were talking about sutures, remember with sutures you put your hands up and squeeze those bones together, and then we put little fibers between those little branches of the bones. Notice with my fontanelles here, I just got this big space that literally all it is are protein fibers. And I've got this big space right here that literally all it is protein fibers. There's no overlapping bones. So it's still made out of those fibers. It's only fibers in these areas. It's not overlapping bone. So by having all of these protein fibers instead of overlapping bones, that gives me a little bit more mobility in my skull bones. And there were two reasons that we said in the lesson that having this flexible or movable skull were good. What were some of those reasons that it was good to have sutures in a fetal skull? Yeah, so a couple of us have mentioned the first reason, the reason I was particularly fond of Fontanelles in May. So the process of birth. The process of birth is already not fun, right? But it would be even worse if a baby had sutures, because then there's no flexibility of the skull bones. So first reason that sutures are great is for the process of birth, the process of squeezing a little head through a tiny birth canal. Absolutely important. Second reason it's good, and a lot of us are mentioning this here too, brain growth. Brain growth. That's another important reason to have these flexible joints. As I can vouch for my son, whose head has grown dramatically since we brought him home from the hospital, there's a ton of brain growth that happens in the first 2 years of life. So you start a little tiny fetal skull, and it's not very long until you've got a big toddler skull, because that brain has grown so much bigger. So we want to have a joint that's a little bit softer, that's maybe a little bit more flexible and movable, to allow that head to pass through the birth canal, but also to give space for the brain to be growing. So first kind of joints that we talked about, the first example we gave of anatomy versus physiology was those types of joints, whether it's the fontanelles in the fetal skull or the sutures in the adult skull or those synovial joints. If I know what their structure is, I can predict how they're going to act. And if I know what I need it to do, so if I know that the brain is going to be growing, I know that I'm going to need a joint that's a little bit softer, or a joint that's a little bit more movable than a suture, for example. So our first example that we had from our lesson of anatomy versus physiology were those joints. The second one that you guys mentioned we wanted to chat about were our blood vessels. So two types of blood vessels in the body. Let's see if we can remember their names. This one over here, we'll start with the fact that this one is really leaky. Do we remember the name of the type of blood vessel that was really leaky? What are those ones with holes called? Yeah, so a couple of us have mentioned it in the chat for me. A leaky blood vessel is called a sinusoid. A sinusoid. These ones over here on the left, the ones that don't leak, we tell that they don't leak based on their name. Their names, they're called continuous, oops, can't spell it, continuous capillaries. I won't make you type that because that's long words, right? So continuous capillaries, the way they got their name is actually from their anatomy. So when we talk about a continuous capillary, in the very middle of that blood vessel, we have a continuous layer of cells, or I have no spaces in between those cells. So the little cells in here are continuous. It's a completely solid barrier. And then on top of that, or on the outside of that, maybe is a little more accurate, you see this blue layer here called the basement membrane. That's also continuous, meaning that there's no space or no holes in that. So when we talk about continuous capillaries, the big idea with their anatomy is that there's no holes, or it's a continuous, again, can't spell, continuous barrier, continuous barrier. When we talk about the sinusoids, we can kind of use our description of the continuous capillaries to fill this one in. The big idea with sinusoid is those holes. It has holes. And I really like it. The note in the chat about thinking about sinusoids, kind of like your sinuses, how they're always draining. I like that. That's a good way to remember it. So your sinuses, especially in allergy season, which is totally like, well, for me, it's like year round. My husband's having some big ragweed issues right now. So think of your sinuses draining because they've got holes. That's absolutely right with our sinusoids over here. So sinusoids have holes. Because they have holes, things can sneak out, right? So we've got holes. Part of their physiology is, we'll just call it stuff. Stuff can leave the blood vessels. Do you guys remember from the lesson some of the stuff? Yeah, so Jacob typed some of that stuff for us. When we say that stuff can leave the red blood vessels, that's going to be things like bacteria and viruses. But that's also going to be things, and we're not out of space, put up here, like red blood cells. They can also leave. When we talk about filtering out things like bacteria and viruses, this is why we're going to see these blood vessels called sinusoids in organs like the lymph nodes to help us filter out, but that's part of the immune system. So to help us filter out things that would make us not healthy, I'm going to have sinusoids. That's going to allow us to filter things out. When we talk about pulling out blood cells, your body is actually really efficient at recycling. And that's a good thing because red blood cells get really beat up. So a typical red blood cell is only going to float around in your body for maybe 4 months max. It has to squeeze into little tiny places and it's going all over the place all the time. It just gets worn out. So we're going to see red blood cells leaving the circulation in places like the spleen, for example, where I pull them out, I break them down, and recycle it to build new ones. Yeah, so I've got a question in the chat about where we would find sinusoids. Do we have some ideas? I mentioned a couple of places. Do you guys remember some of the places that we find them? So let's add a little area for ourselves here. Location. Some of our places. Let me change back to blue here. Yeah, so big place we're going to find them is the liver, because the liver is a filtering hub in your body. Another place we're going to find them, another filtering hub in the body, is the spleen. So an interesting note about the kidney, and I think somebody may have asked about that from the Blackboard homework as well. When we talk about the kidney, it actually doesn't have sinusoids. The kidney has continuous capillaries. Why that is important is because the kinds of things that leave sinusoids, we're not pulling them out in the kidney. In other words, normally you should not be peeing blood. Let's just be blunt, right? We'll do a blunt example, because red blood cells can leave these blood vessels to go out places from a sinusoid. We don't want you to have red cells in your pee. That's a bad idea. You're supposed to have continuous capillaries. Continuous capillaries can let small things out. So they don't have holes. It doesn't mean that stuff can't get through, but what can get through, here we'll put a note on our physiology, small things can get through. Things like water, things like potassium or sodium, for example, electrolytes. Small things can get through these barriers here. Large things cannot. If large things are getting out, so for example, if you are peeing out blood cells, what that means is your blood vessels in the kidneys are actually not healthy. It means something's going wrong. So we should not see large things getting out in places where we have continuous capillaries. So I know that one's a little bit tricky, but when we talk about locations of our continuous capillaries, one of the places we'd find them is the kidneys. I think I saw a couple others in the chat. Help me out. What are some of the other places with continuous capillaries, these leaking ones? Yeah, so the brain is a big one. The lungs are a big one as well. Possibly the heart, but I am not 100% on that, Gloria. So if you found that somewhere, that is possibly correct. The big ones I know for sure are these three that we listed. The kidneys, the brain, and the lungs. 100% I know those ones have continuous capillaries. So anatomy of these guys. We have a completely continuous layer of cells and connective tissue. That means their physiology is that not a lot of stuff can get through. We're going to keep stuff inside, especially stuff like bacteria and viruses. I want bacteria and viruses to leave my bloodstream because I want to get rid of them. I want to be able to fight that infection that I'm having. or I want those old worn out red blood cells to leave my bloodstream too. It's just, I don't want to be doing that in places like the brain or the lungs. I want to be doing that in places like the liver or the spleen, and that's why I put sinusoids in those places. Yeah, so there's a comment in our a discussion about continuous capillaries being in areas that are vital and that can't do recycling. Absolutely. The other word that we can use to describe some of the areas that we find continuous blood vessels, immunoprivileged. I always spell this wrong. Let's see if I can get it right. Immunoprivileged. I think that's right. That's wrong. Privileged. Okay. What this word means is I don't have a lot of an immune system there. So in places like your brain and your lungs, I don't have a lot of immune system cells that float around in my brain. I don't have a lot of immune system cells that live in my lungs. I want to make sure that bacteria and viruses aren't going to these places. So yeah, places that can't do that recycling, that are not going to be able to break up what can leave, I definitely want to put continuous capillaries in those places. Absolutely. Let me see in the chat what questions you still have, or shoot me an emoji about our blood vessels or about our joints. What are we thinking here on the blood vessels and joints? Pull this over. So the question is from the chat is, so basically things can't get out of continuous capillaries, but they can from sinusoids. Yes, that's a great summary. We can't leave a continuous capillary unless that capillary is damaged, and then it might leak, and that's a reason for your doctors to be concerned. So yeah, can't get out of continuous capillaries, but absolutely can from those sinusoids. And the question is there any other physiology for the continuous capillaries? I guess the other thing that we would put for their physiology, right, is that most things don't leave. We'll put it that way. Basically, for their physiology, stuff can't get out. That might be a good way to summarize it. We don't usually get stuff out. Little tiny things, sure. Electrolytes, water, that kind of stuff can get out, but most things can't. So they're basically sealed. That's their physiology. All right, in the little brief time that I have left, let me show you guys, let me look at Hunter's question here. The size of an object, is that more anatomy or physiology? That's a question I want to put to the class. What do we think? When we're talking about the size of something, do you think that's anatomy or physiology? Let's see what we vote as a class. What do we think? Yeah, so I would say something like the size or the shape. Those are definitely anatomy type things. When we're talking about how that size or shape impacts the function of a structure, then we're doing physiology. But its basic size, its basic shape, its color, for example, all of those kind of things we would say is anatomy. Yeah, so Jacqueline's asking what we would say the anatomy of the liver is or the heart is. It's basically just what's there. So you could talk about the types of cells that we find in the liver or the heart. You could talk about the basic shape of the liver or the heart. You could tell me the location of the liver and the heart. But what you wouldn't tell me, for example, is that the anatomy of the heart is that it pumps blood. No, that's its job. That's its physiology. The heart is found in the middle of the chest. Sure, that's its anatomy. That's where it's located. So its location, its description, yeah, its shape or its color, those kind of things we'd call anatomy. Anything that the organs do, any that their function is, that would be considered their physiology. Anything function related. Yeah, so we talked about this yesterday with lab stuff. Because someone said, I feel like it's more difficult than it is. Yeah, so remember, there's the phrase, keep it simple. I was thinking about it yesterday. Keep it simple, students. instead of the phrase being mean, saying keep it simple, stupid. So keep it simple, students. If we're talking about what's there or where something's at or what it looks like, we are talking about anatomy. If we're talking about what it does, how it functions, we're talking physiology. So keep it simple. I promise. Something where it is, it's more straightforward than you're afraid that it is. And I missed a question up above about what we need to know about the blood vessels. I'm not going to ask you to label the pictures, so you don't need to go through and learn things like the nucleus of the cells or where the intracellular cleft is. You might want to know that word intracellular cleft just means the space between cells. But that's not one of the words that I have listed for you guys on your first learning objective, the define learning objective, words you need to know. So you don't need to know that word. You just need to know that those cells don't have space between them in a continuous capillary. All right, I want to show you guys really fast. We're about out of time, talking time for me, but let me show you guys the brown fat and white fat thing, the last thing we have going on this week. Hopefully it's not too small on your screen. Let me zoom in a little bit more. Okay, here's where we're at right now. Let me pull up my menu. Okay, when you're in Blackboard, over on the very left side, remember this has some general course information in it. Lecture resources is where I am right now. When we're lecture resources, until we take exam number 1, we're doing unit number 1 right here. So when I open up unit number 1, I'll show you stuff. I'll mention, by the way, down here, lecture exams. When we take exam number 1, this is where you're going to find it. And I'll just pull this up to mention, when you take exam number 1, you need to have a thing called Proctorio installed on your computer, completely free, and it only runs when you're taking an exam. But please use these directions to try to get Proctorio installed ASAP, just to make sure that you know it works. When you take an exam, you might want to get in the habit of clicking on this link right here. All it does is make sure that Proctorio is active on your computer, because if you try to take an exam when Proctorio is not active, it's going to ask you for a password, and I promise there's no password that you need. You just need Proctorio activated. So install Proctorio, and then every time before we take an exam, just click on this link to make sure that Proctorio is active. Here is a practice test for you. It's not actually a content test, so you don't have to study for it or anything. This will help you know if Proctorio is working on your computer. So sometime in the next couple of weeks, just so that we're not putting it off till the very end, please do go through and try this practice test to make sure you've got Proctorio working on your computer. All of that, though, is in that lecture exams folder. Let me go back to where we were, because brown fat and white fat, all that jazz, that's here in the unit number 1 folder. Let me look at my chat really fast and see what we posted. Yeah, so that's correct. The exams are worth 40% of your grade. So you do want to study for them and prepare for them. Definitely prepare well for them. You see, oh, we're all funky because I'm zoomed in. Let me zoom out a little bit, see if I can get my computer's probably mad because I've been bouncing around between stuff. Here we go. Okay, so we're here in lesson number 1. By Sunday, all of this needs to be done. The last thing, so we talked a lot about this lesson number 1 stuff, which is the anatomy versus physiology. But the other thing that we need to do this time is the brown fat and white fat activity sheet. So I'll pull this up to show you. This is basically the way that I want you to take notes on the article that I'm sending you to. So there's a link in the assignment sheet itself. There's also a link in Blackboard. When you pull it up, here's what the website looks like. It's a short article from Women's Health magazine that talks about the 2 kinds of fat that you have in your body. So there's what you might call good fat, which is the brown fat, and there's the bad fat called white fat. So your job in reading this article is using the stuff we talked about, so the anatomy and the physiology of things, to relate those things together, because the anatomy of white fat is very different from the anatomy of brown fat, and that's going to allow them to do their different jobs. So keep in mind that you have this outline. Again, I would recommend you download it and print it so that you can answer these questions. For the most part, the answers to these questions, you'll find them in the order that they're written, except, for example, this one right here. And I put a note for you. You might have to go to the very end of the section to find the answer to this one. But read your way through that article, answer the questions as you bump into them to help you compare brown fat to white fat. And just like we have a homework assignment for lesson number 1 for the anatomy versus physiology stuff we just talked about, there's also one for brown fat versus white fat. So I'll point out that there's also this homework assignment too. This homework assignment and the lesson number 1 homework assignment due Sunday night. So please get on it. You can do it early. You can't do it late. So anytime between now and Sunday, let's get this brown fat, white fat thing done. And I'll just mention, we talked about group wikis. The other thing due on Sunday is your first group wiki that I promise is super easy. It just asks you some basic, I want to get to know you information. So make sure to complete that by Sunday night as well. I did get some student emails asking me, well, what if a group member doesn't complete this first group wiki? If they don't do their part on this, I mean, you can't make up for them why they're taking anatomy, right? And you can't make up for them why, how COVID has affected their life, right? So don't worry about it if you have group members that don't answer the questions. For this first one, we are just writing about how things have affected us because we don't know other people's stories, right? So last assignment, that's due on Sunday. I've probably got about 3 more minutes of camera time. Do we have any questions that I can answer in the next 2 or 3 minutes, or that you want me to answer via talking as opposed to typing? I appreciate the compliment. Thank you. Yes, so to reiterate, as Jacob mentioned, visible body, only thing due on Friday. Everything else is due on Sunday. And absolutely, to Jacqueline's question, yes, your best bet is 100% is studying the outlines. When I ask students what they do to succeed in the class, what's the most helpful for them, it's those outlines. And it's also, I'll pop up since there's one in here, it's also the learning objectives. So I'm not going to make you guys a study guide for the exam because you have the study guide. At the beginning of each lesson outline, you have a list of learning objectives that tell you what you are expected to know from that per lesson. So that's your study guide. If you can organize your information based on it in those things called learning objectives, you'll be in good shape for the exams if we can do everything the learning objectives say to do. The visible body grades, yeah, they're not going to show up automatically in Blackboard. I will probably pull them over to Blackboard the week of the midterm exam. So I actually have to download them out of visible body and then put them into Blackboard. So you're not going to see those ones in Blackboard except for at midterm time and probably final time. But Jacqueline's absolutely right. You can see them in the visible body gradebook. So your scores in the visible body gradebook are what you will get when I transfer it over to our class. I just will have to do that manually, so it's probably only going to happen a couple of times during the semester. And yeah, recommendations for exam studying is number 1, fill out those outlines. Number 2, do those homework assignments as many times as possible to really test your understanding. And then number 3, if you want to try to organize your notes in one place, make that place a document that you put all of the learning objectives from each of the lessons into, and then organize the information in these ways. If you can do that and can organize it that way, you're in good shape. And yes, a visible body question, the only things that are for a grade in visible body are the things with the stars, with the asterisks. That's correct. And one of them is a reminder that you've got an assignment in Blackboard. So there's 2 starred assignments this week in visible body. Make sure you get those ones done in visible body and then go back to Blackboard to do your first lab assignment. All right. I am probably going to turn off my camera and my mic. I will stay in the chat area for a little bit if you have questions. And as always, over the weekend, please feel free to reach out via email. Just make sure that you're giving me a 24-hour reply window. I will try to reply faster than that, but I don't know if any of you guys got emails from me yesterday. Prime email time is about 11 at night. So you may not hear back from me until the next day around 11 at night. So give a bit of time if you have a question via email, and I will get posted for you by Sunday a list of what our sessions next week will be. But yeah, it'll be a lot like this. I'm glad that you all are showing up. We're having some fun with those groups. So hopefully we can have some more fun next week too. So I'll stick around in the chat for a little bit, but I'm going to go ahead and turn off my mic and my camera. So have a great afternoon.